You know, even the thing about forced interventions aimed at correcting or improving an impairment. And the idea was that in the that it would be so clear, and because we were putting it forward, we were making the arguments as to why these things should be put in, talking about forced drugging, but the language itself was framed generally in terms of disability for that reason, because we didn't want to be isolated. So then it was up to this Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities to interpret it, to make explicit that yes, this means you have to abolish forced psychiatry, which they have done. Also, to resolve ambiguities, in Article 12 on legal capacity, there were a couple of things that were not entirely clear, and when we finished the negotiations, my position on it was that, my position at the very end of negotiations was that we have enough in the text that the only legally sound interpretation, really, given the way treaties are supposed to be interpreted, is that we have to have complete, full legal capacity and no more guardianship, no more substitute decision-making. And it turned out that that was correct. The committee agreed with me. We did a lot of promotional activities because right at the end, after the negotiations, my colleagues and I, I'm just going to say no. I don't know what I said no to. It seemed like no was a better answer than yes. I don't know. We decided we have to promote the text as we want it to be understood.
You're not accepting your yes.
Yeah, right. They're not accepting my refusal, but I'm going to keep refusing. So, yeah, we decided that we had to talk about it, promote that. The convention said what we were advocating that the interpretation should be, and explaining it all over the place. And that actually helped to make the interpretation go the way that we wanted it to. The treaty body, you know, they were interpreting the convention as a way of enhancing, improving, you know, guaranteeing the rights of people with disabilities. So of course you'd want to, they would want to interpret it in a way that favors what people with disabilities actually need the convention to be. So they put in, they issued a general comment on legal capacity on Article 12. It was the first general comment they issued in 2014, showing the importance that the whole international community of people with disabilities was giving to this issue, and guidelines on Article 14, liberty and security of the person. I have other UN mechanisms and agencies also contributing to this, the development of this standard, including, notably, the World Health Organization. Last year, they actually, the main Facebook account, not just this one little unit that we've been working with to develop some good policy, but the main Facebook account of the World Health Organization put out a meme saying end coercion in mental health. And that was a pretty good milestone. So, national practice, Peru has enacted a legal capacity reform that is really complying with the convention. That's a huge landmark, and Peru is also close to eliminating remaining bases for forced psychiatry. Costa Rica also has a promising legal capacity reform. In Spain, there's a mental health bill just introduced by Podemos, a left-wing political party that includes the prohibition of non-consensual admissions and treatment. That's also huge because there is no mental health law in the world to date that prohibits. All of them allow and authorize So we don't know if that's going to go through. It's a very small political party, so we have to see how that develops. Here in the US, the thing that I find the most promising is the Disability Integration Act. Its bill numbers currently are S-117 and H.R. 555. It would create an enforceable right to be provided with non-coercive services in the community. There's a lot of good stuff in there that relates to people labeled with psychiatric disabilities. However, absent an intent to override state mental health laws, it's not clear how big of an impact it's going to have. So I've been doing my best to work with one of the people from the disability community who's been most involved with that bill to try and get changes to make it the strongest that we can. And I think that if this is passed, it can indicate some policy going in the right direction, but it's not going to be enough. So there's a lot more work to do. The US and CRPD, President Obama signed, I think it was in 2009, so shortly after even he came into office, but it requires 2/3 of the Senate for ratification. They were working very hard, never got the 2/3 while Obama was there. The administration and the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations included huge amounts of reservations, understandings, and declarations in their ratification proposal, even more extensive than what the US has put on other treaties. And my organization was speaking out against that. We got some other human rights NGOs in the US to sign on to letters with us, but unfortunately the mainstream disability community in this country has been silent. And my feeling is that they don't understand for themselves the value of international human rights for themselves as a movement in this country. They don't understand, what another US human rights group that I'm part of calls bringing human rights home. They think that, in my perception, they think that ratifying the CRPD means that we're going to help other countries do better, like come up to our standard. And for people who are survivors of psychiatry, the U.S. isn't anything worth copying. We're just as bad as other countries. I don't think we're even among the ones who could be pointed to as having a lot of good stuff. We have some peer support things and, I don't know what, but we're pretty bad. So, so we can't afford to take that kind of, blasé position about it. Ratifying, even with the RUDs, would get us to the CRPD committee in Geneva, and in that way could provide a forum for national debate on the abolition of forced psychiatry as a human rights and non-discrimination issue. But there again, it's even unclear what some of the reservations, understandings, and declarations, how they would really impact trying to use this as a forum to discuss the abolition of forced psychiatry. It kind of can get technical, but they've just made it and muddied it quite a bit, because the reservation isn't directly on the substantive issue. They make a reservation saying that this only applies insofar as the U.S. federal government has any obligations in these particular areas. Meaning, okay, so what do? We have mental health laws and guardianship laws and many other things relating to legal capacity exist at the statewide level, not the federal level. So what does the federal government think its responsibility is on these issues? And then in case we were thinking like, well, the federal government has power, it can enact civil rights legislation, it can enact legislation based on the spending power, they could take away the money for any mental health system that's going to keep using force. Well, then they put in another declaration stating that US law exceeds or complies with its obligations. And I'm like, you're declaring that. What does it mean that you declare that? Does it mean that you actually intend that you're not going to change any of your laws? Or that you don't? Does it mean that it's just your opinion right now at this point in time? That's your opinion, Senate, that, you know. So that would be kind of a question that I'm sure the CRPD committee would ask them if it ever got ratified with that. We would certainly urge the CRPD committee to ask them that. And then, you know, the US government might answer or it might not. It would probably just try to keep it all vague. Other UN treaty bodies available to people in the United States are not supportive on this question. So the United States has ratified, well, actually one of them is. The Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, that treaty body actually is open to us. And so my organization with a few other colleagues submitted a shadow report to that treaty body, and we've got to follow up on it because at that point all they asked was for the US government to address this issue in the next report. So that's something we should follow up. But the other treaties, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the Convention Against Torture, the treaty bodies that monitored those conventions have actually kept the pre-CRPD standard of accepting forced psychiatry and just saying there have to be procedural safeguards. So we keep, once in a while, I made a report under the ICCPR this last time, and I spoke to one member of that treaty body who was very supportive, but she's one, and there's the other 17 or so, and she apparently didn't get anybody else to agree with her because they didn't ask any questions on our issue. Also, another thing to notice is the New York State Surrogates Court in Manhattan has cited CRPD in a case. They did that, it was a particular judge named Kristen Booth Glenn. She was also previously my law school dean, and she was connecting with another law school alum who was working on this issue, who's a woman who has a sister with intellectual disability. The Surrogates Court decides cases of guardianship, particularly for people with intellectual disabilities under particular provision of the law. And so she cited the CRPD even before the treaty body started coming out with their interpretation. But she had a pretty good discussion of the CRPD in this opinion. But the main holding was that you have to consider supported decision-making as a less restrictive alternative to guardianship. You can't have a system that's either or. Either you think the person needs no help in making decisions, or you put them under guardianship. You have to at least make, if they have the potential to have supported decision-making from people around them, you have to allow that. So it was pretty good. But not enough for what we want in terms of the abolition of forced psychiatry and the abolition of any of this kind of coercion against us. So, but it also does show that that's available to judges. Judges in the US can cite international law as persuasive authority. It's not mandatory, it's not binding on US courts. Even if we ratify it does not, because of the particular reservations they make, it does not become binding in the courts. But they can always use it if they want to, and that's something that lawyers can and advocates can think about. The way forward is unclear. We need political and legal strategies. You know, if there was any possible way to introduce legislation in any state to abolish forced psychiatry, that would take a lot of political work to actually make happen, but I actually had talked at one point to colleagues in Vermont where there was an initiative by people who wanted to actually increase force in psychiatry, and they were considering, well, one thing we could do is to counter that by saying, we have to abolish forced psychiatry. And that could have been an interesting strategy, that it could have helped to counter that move to increase the force and pave the way for some discussions. So I'll leave it there. I have a slide with my website and an email if anyone wants to contact me, and I can also make these slides available if there's any website you have to distribute to people. So thank you for listening, and open for
we have time for questions.
Questions?
Do you think there are any state senators that would be interested in co-sponsoring such legislation at the state level?
Not that I know of. I mean, I am not really that involved in politics in the U.S. I'm almost like almost like equally involved here as I am in any other country. I sort of need people to be able to figure that out with me, especially the political aspect of it. I mean, there was a state senator, Assemblyman Ortiz, who way back, actually before I was working on this stuff, so back around 2000, 2001, there was legislation introduced in New York on the issue of electroshock, and this person was very supportive, of that, and seemed generally supportive on the issues.
Supportive of electroshock or
No, supportive of banning it, or I don't think even banning it was supportive of banning forced electroshock and requiring reporting of electroshock and really strong free and informed consent. So he would be somebody that I would think of, but that was a long time ago also, and I don't know what his positions or any work is like now.
How does, I guess, a free and informed consent coincide with capacity?
Okay, well, that's a good question, because in the law of New York and other states in the US, and most, I guess, all other jurisdictions really in the world, the way free and informed consent is usually conceived of includes the idea that you have capacity to consent. That if you're considered to not have the capacity, then there's no valid consent. However, what we're doing with the CRPD, with Article 12, we make legal capacity into a right instead of something that's more like a privilege or a conditionality. And one of the ways that I think about it is the term capacity actually has two meanings, because there's capacity that's something that can be evaluated as an individual, like meaning similar to ability. But there's also capacity that's simply a kind of legal standing or legal power. So if you, in another kind of context, if you think about something like the competence of a court to hear a particular case, you're not talking about whether the judge has a high level of ability. You're talking about whether the court is empowered to hear that case. And so similarly, when we talk about legal capacity as a right, we're simply talking about, we're saying that everyone, every adult, is now under the CRPD empowered to make their own decisions. So that this question of capacity as ability that gets, merged with the concept of being empowered under law to make your own decisions, we take away that aspect of ability and we say, it doesn't matter what your ability is. You have a right as a human being to make your own decisions. That applies clearly and directly to adults. When we're talking about children, the CRPD doesn't say that children have the same legal capacity as adults. Some of us think that the concept of supported decision-making can be applied quite a bit to children. What I would say is that children differ from adults because they also need guidance from adults. Adults with even very extensive disabilities, you can say, well, I'm giving this person support. I'm giving this person as much support as they need. I'm going to work with them as much as they need for me to be able to understand what they're communicating about what their will actually is. What does this person actually want and what don't they want? And if I'm not actually sure, I'm going to make my best interpretation. I'm going to really do my utmost to be faithful to what this person wants. And that's also in the general comment that I mentioned, this concept of making a best interpretation if you really can't determine for sure. But with children, you can say, well, children also need guidance, and that's part of what we understand as being a child. So a lot of there's quite a bit that has to be worked out in practice. I think Peru and also probably Costa Rica are the places where, we're gonna have to look and see what they're actually doing in these kind of situations in practice.
So you're saying that they're doing a good job or a really bad job?
A good job,
A good job.
because Peru made the first legal capacity reform that actually really complies with the convention. And they're a civil law country. We're a common law, and then the other main kind of law that exists in the world is civil law, where it's a system of law that is our system of law with common law is a lot based on judges adjudicating particular cases and developing precedents. We have statutes, but the basis of our legal system is judges adjudicating and developing precedents. The basis of civil law is statutes and especially these very overarching or important statutes that they call codes. So the civil code is where you would find everything about legal capacity and contracts and even corporations in a civil law country, and they reformed their civil code to make sure that people with disabilities have equal legal capacity. Yeah.
What about, I guess, the intersection of the criminal justice system with psychiatric disabilities? How should those be handled? Is this the case?
Yeah, thank you. That's another good question, and I actually should have put that in. It's not explicit in the text of the convention itself. The convention, but the article on legal capacity says legal capacity on an equal basis with others in all aspects of life. It does not say only in civil, in civil fields, which actually the CEDAW Convention and there in the Convention on Discrimination, on the elimination of all forms of discrimination against women, in that article on legal capacity, it's limited to civil issues or civil matters. We didn't limit it to civil matters in the convention. So my interpretation and advocacy has been that it applies in the criminal context as well. Another approach to dealing with it as legal capacity is that even in civil matters, like if I give informed consent, it's a kind of a contract, and I'm taking the responsibility on myself for consenting to this, and I'm saying, yes, I consent to this. If you do it to me and you don't commit malpractice, then I don't have any claim against you. I consented to it. Even if later on I think, well, that really was not a necessary operation or whatever. Okay. So, and then if you make a contract, like make a contract for a sale of a house, that's a binding contract, and you have the responsibility to uphold your ends. So we have responsibility in civil law. And if I'm a homeowner and I have a condition that, a bad condition in my steps, and a delivery person comes up the steps and hurts themselves, then I could be liable to them. That's also responsibility. So I think in the same way, that's not so different from criminal responsibility. And also, under Article 14, there's Article 13 actually on access to justice is also relevant, and Article 14 addresses issues of deprivation of liberty. That's where the CRPD committee, it's under Article 14, the CRPD committee has addressed issues of criminal responsibility. And I have been advocating this. I'm probably the main person who has been advocating it, but they have come out to say that there should not be declarations of non-responsibility or declarations of unfitness to plead. Instead, people with disabilities should be given support and accommodations to undergo the trial, to be held guilty or not guilty on an equal basis. They're also promoting restorative justice. That's something I've promoted as well. It seems like when you start saying, oh, people with disabilities should be held responsible equally as others, everybody gets nervous, like, oh, oh, do we want more people going into the criminal justice system? It's so horrible, right? And I mean, in fact, in the US, there's not that many people who plead the insanity defense for many reasons, but in some other countries, it's actually something that gets done even without the person making an affirmative plea. So it's really been something more developed in the context of those other countries where a judge decides that. But this is one of the issues, and I wrote an article about that, also published in a law review, called Rethinking Criminal Responsibility.
The right to say, I do want to be regarded as responsible for my actions.
Hmm?
The right to say that I do want to be held
Yeah.
responsible for my actions.
Yeah, and I mean, I think also it's like the right to some extent, we're sort of, I mean, there's one way of doing it that would be like to make it purely about what the person wants as an individual. Like either you plead the insanity defense or you say, I insist on being held responsible. But, okay, for one thing, one of the issues here is that if you plead the insanity defense, or if you're held non-responsible because of your disability, you go into the psychiatric system. You don't just go free. So here it's considered an insanity acquittal, but it's not a real acquittal because you get locked up. And you may get locked up for longer than you would if you were serving your criminal sentence.
And with fewer rights.
Absolutely.
And fewer rights. So the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities has also linked it to that. So usually the way they've been saying it is that states should abolish these declarations of non-responsibility and the associated disability-based detention. If there was no detention as a result, would we want it? And there, it's like a question also of the dignity of people with disabilities as a whole. Do we want there to exist this possibility of saying, because I have this disability, I'm not responsible? I actually think we don't. I think there's something morally wrong about that to say, like, okay, you're not
May I have your
responsible.
attention, please? The library will be closing in 30 minutes. If you wish to borrow materials, please come to the checkout desk now. The public computers will be turned off in 15 minutes. Thank you.
Okay. So, so like, if I can't hold you responsible, how am I going to have a relationship with you as an equal? I don't want there to be people in the society who can't be held responsible. That I don't think that's right. And then how we deal with that, that's where at least the idea or what we would like restorative justice to be comes in. That we would like there to be some way of dealing with harms that one person might do to another without this response, okay, we just lock you away, and then what do we do with you? You're still a person, you're still there, and you're being harmed by this horrible system, but you're still there, you're still a person. What are we actually doing to make any change?
Treatment-wise?
In terms of
Just
like,
I'm trying.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
so if a criminal were be responsible for their actions and go into the penitentiary, then it's also a matter of also treating them, for rehabilitation. But you consent, obviously. It's just that, do we offer that? Like, do we have that provided for them?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's different ways of looking at rehabilitation. There's one way of looking at it that is actually kind of like the psychiatric system in a way that says, if you committed a crime, there's something wrong with you and we have to fix you to make you fit to live in society. That concept I disagree with. I do fervently agree with rehabilitation that's about giving the person the resources that might help them to go wherever they might actually want to go. So yeah, if people want mental health counseling or support services, trauma counseling, there's stuff that's been done. There was a movie about women, a trauma counseling support for women in prison that really had a huge impact on them managing to turn their lives around. So that kind of thing, sure, and education opportunities, yeah.
Kind of mentioned that in New York State, there's Kendra's law, which is
Yeah.
a forced treatment regime, but it also allows people to get resources they can't get otherwise.
Yeah, we got to take away the force.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, yeah, it's a terrible thing to have to put somebody in a situation where, it's like you're giving them something, but you're taking so much away from them. And it creates a kind of very negative, it's like it's creating an abusive relationship. To the extent that the person actually wants the resources they're getting, which not everybody does, But to the extent that the person actually wants it or accepts it and starts to feel like they're benefiting from it, but then, you know, they're under this regime where anytime somebody thinks that they're not complying, that they're not taking the medication, or, you know, maybe starting to get a little excited, they can and will lock you back up again. And I have a friend that has happened to many times, and it's a disaster.
It sounds like a pyramid scheme.
Hmm?
It sounds like a pyramid scheme.
Pyramids.
And it starts with the school to prison pipeline. I'm a special
Yeah.
education teacher, and I have a student who is diagnosed emotionally disturbed. And they will not give him an IEP because it changes the rules on how you can discipline a student. If a student is classified as emotionally disturbed, then you know you can't just automatically suspend them for acting out because there are mitigating causes for their behavior. So instead, this kid has no IEP, and he's basically not getting any of the resources that he needs because you know we don't have that legal document to help him, and it's just and it's terrible because I genuinely care about this student, but I believe that our public school is not the appropriate placement for him, and I believe that he's a danger to himself and his peers because he's not getting the right supports. And so what's going to happen is instead of getting the help that he needs, he's going to get labeled a bad kid, and he's going to eventually start getting suspended, and then eventually he's going to get frustrated and drop out and then become involved in criminal activity, and then he's going to wind up in the Nassau County juvenile justice system, where I personally have been, and it is not a pleasant place. And then from there you go down a whole new rabbit hole of, you know, group homes and, you know, all kinds of other things. And so we really have to look at the big picture and not just, you know, the mental health system and not just the justice system and not just the public schools, but basically how all of these systems interconnect, you know, by design, and the harmful relationship and, you know, the impact on society.
Yeah, and I mean, I think schools need to be able to deal with all students and need to be able, and all students need to have the resources to be able to make it in schools. So education isn't something I've really looked at a lot, but the CRPD does have an article on education and a general comment about that, and it's very strong on promoting full inclusive education. I think that's an important point, you know, that students need to be able to get the resources that they actually need, and children also have a right to not have things done to them against their will. So I know that there's a lot of things happening where kids are essentially being forced to take psychiatric drugs,
Yes.
put on drugs. They don't have any choice in it, and kids are growing up and coming to high school and college and even law school, and they've been on drugs their whole life, and they don't, you know, I met people who were on drugs their whole life, didn't know who they were without a drug. And just one other thing about that colleagues of mine in the African American community have called attention that it's not just a school to prison pipeline, there's also a school to psychiatry pipeline.
Yeah.
And we need to look at those two together and definitely the interactions of all of these systems.
Yeah.
I was one of the people who had a lot of dubiety about that I was not convinced that going at it as a disability issue was the way to go, because we're not disabled, you know. But you know, in retrospect, I see that this was a really brilliant strategy. My thinking at the time was more like they claimed that we have a difference, but there's this jump that they've made that gets from difference to pathology, and that seemed like an area that was worth questioning. That why can't we be people who are different, who have minds that are different, who have behaviors that are different, but if we don't find the way we are to be inferior and experience, where do they get calling our difference a disease? And in many ways, in other words, to follow the path of the gay and lesbian people who said, we're different, we're not sick.
Yeah,
But
We
this,
still have the autism community,
yeah.
yeah.
And the DSM had those pathologized, and the homosexuality was pathologized.
That's
Until,
right.
until gay activists said, no, take us out of there. So, you know.
The thing is, everybody wants to get out of mental health. And I think, yes, we all need to get, because now I'm in touch with the autistic community
Mhm.
and people with dementia.
Yeah.
And they're saying, take us out of mental health.
Right.
And I actually get furious when they, when they come to these UN meetings, and it's like, okay, yes, you want to be taken out of mental health. They want to say we're people with cognitive disabilities about themselves. Okay, fine, but don't just say you want to be taken out of mental health and leave us in there. Okay, so like that's, but it's very tricky, and that's part of the piece that I'm really working on now. So now that the CRPD committee is very clear, abolition of forced psychiatry, full legal capacity. So now, how do we understand the positive policies? How do we understand, like, the totality of the human rights of people who have been psychiatrized, people with psychosocial disabilities, various names people are using for this? And what do we actually want to put in place? Part of it, I think, is, deconstructing the whole thing and saying there's no real, there's many different things going on. Some of us might identify with mental diversity. Some of us might just say, I don't, none of that. It's like, I'm just a person, and, there doesn't need to be any particular anything that I identify with. Maybe I just want to have support if I'm going through a hard time. Or maybe I just want people to leave me alone and accept that I'm going to go off into the woods. And I'm not going to tell you why. I'm not going to tell you, I'm having a hard time even necessarily. Just like, okay, I think we're at a point, at least in the UN, where we can have some of those conversations. I think the difficulty is, like, is that something that can be put into some kind of policy, that particular piece of it? Because there's other pieces that could more easily be put into policy, but there's a lot of pieces there. And then you had a question, and then you.
Yeah, I was going to ask about, the reason why I asked before about the criminal stuff, and my next question is about the guardianship, is that I just hear, like, the opposition seems to just basically, like, harness fear, and so is the guardianship that you started to talk about just now, you were saying how, like, children, like, will be medicated all the way through, and does that stem through whatever that guardianship, I think it was like an influence that was in an organization in the convention?
I mean,
I'm referring to?
I'm not sure what the organization, along with the World Network of Users and Survivors of Psychiatry, that was advocating against guardianship, was inclusion in, they actually started out saying that there needs to be alternatives to guardianship, but thinking that, okay, guardianship could still exist as a last resort. They came to advocate, they ended up together with us.
Guardianship, like, just officially means.
What guardianship? Okay, we're talking about now adult guardianship, guardianship of adults, not guardianship of children, because nobody is contesting the fact that parents, have responsibilities towards their children.
Okay, that
Yeah.
gives up something too.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry. So, and it's understandable because I didn't really know that much about guardianship before I got involved with this. Guardianship is something where.
But for like elderly that.
Yeah. Exactly. And often, in addition to elderly people, people with intellectual disabilities, and that's a term people might not know, it's the same, it's close, it's similar, sometimes they're called people with developmental disabilities, used to be called mental retardation. That's considered not appropriate terminology anymore. So people with intellectual disabilities often, when they turn 18, their parents immediately go into court and get guardianship over them so that the parent never loses control. The parent, even when this person becomes an adult, the person is still, the parent is
Their
still.
legal status is like a child.
Exactly. And that's, and they get treated as if they were
May I have your
children for
attention,
their whole
please? The
lives.
library is closing at 9 p.m. Please bring all materials to the checkout desk now. All public computers will be turned off at this time. Storage areas are now unavailable. Thank you.
We need to get you to the
Yeah.
training too.
Yeah.
We included it.
Thank
Thank you very much. Thanks for your
you.
time.
Thank you, and feel free to email me anybody if anything you ever want to discuss.
We have a website and I go to the information
Great.
on it.
Okay.
While you guys are wrapping up, I do have pamphlets from PANIC, it's the Prison Abolitionists of Nassau, inciting change. We also have a petition, tangentially related, for incarcerated people in Nassau County. They're forced to perform labor and they're not compensated for their work. So we're demanding that incarcerated people in Nassau County be paid minimum wage for the labor that they are forced to perform while they are incarcerated. So if anybody would like to sign that petition or take a pamphlet, I would appreciate that immensely. Sorry.
And that's okay, and we're gonna have a speaker from your organization come and speak to us in August.
Woo!
Okay.
Okay.
Cool.
Fun stuff there.
I got glue sticks and everything.
All that stuff.
That's handy.
Great.
I've kind of followed the works, there aren't that many lawyers, I guess.
For head technically. Hands free, hands
Ellen
free.
Sachs.